Firstly, just like to say a very warm welcome to everyone. Great to see you all here again this evening. Really, really good. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognising their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So we've got a really great session this evening. In a moment, we'll hear from David Pocock, Senator David Pocock, and then after this from Mark Mills, who's a partner at Generation Investment Management. And Mark's going to talk about the investor road to net zero. Now, with the next federal election announced for Saturday, May the 3rd, there are less than 3 weeks to go now until polling day. And also, just as David was mentioning there, the pre-polls open in a week's time on Tuesday, the 22nd of April, and it's expected, I think, around the country, and obviously in some places more than others, to be a very strong turnout at the pre-polls as well. So things are sort of kicking off very imminently. Last month, many of you joined us and we heard from Dr. Sophie Scomps, MP, independent and member for Mackellar, as well as Kaz Heiss, who is standing in Cowper as an independent. And also we heard from Nicolette Bole, who is standing in Bradfield as an independent. And they were all really, really impressive. So tonight, we're very fortunate to have Senator David Pocock, independent senator for the ACT, joining us. Just a little bit of background, I suppose, in just recent times with David. In the 2022 federal election, David ran as an independent candidate for one of the Australian Capital Territory's 2 Senate seats. He defeated Liberal incumbent Senator Zed Seselja, ending the two major parties' duopoly on the ACT's Senate delegation, which had been in place since the ACT was granted Senate representation in 1975. David's very passionate about climate change and the environment, among many other things. He graduated with a Masters of Sustainable Agriculture from Charles Sturt University. And David's just going to give us a quick overview of his work over the last few years in Parliament. Maybe then we'll talk a little bit, David, about the upcoming federal election, just get your perspective there. And then if elected, hopefully, then your aims for the next Parliament as well. So thanks for joining us and over to you.
Cheers. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for your work holding these, and thanks for the opportunity to chat this evening. With the election called, I've sort of been looking back over this Parliament and sort of really trying to think about what has and hasn't been achieved. And I think after a decade of inaction, frustration, Labor were elected with, I think, a really strong mandate on climate and the environment. And you had this growing crossbench, almost a third of the Parliament now, listening to their communities across the country who are saying, let's get on with it. Let's actually put into place some of the things that we haven't done over the last decade and really start to make decisions for the longer term and make decisions like we actually plan on being here for a long time. Because my sense and what I hear from people here in Canberra is that people are pretty frustrated with short-term thinking and that they can see it catching up with us. Despite that mandate, I think Labor have to be commended. They actually legislated for the first time an emissions reduction target. I'd say it was the absolute bare minimum and definitely less than the crossbench would have liked, but really tried to use leverage in that to add a lot more transparency around the way that updates happen in the Parliament, the work that the various agencies are doing, and really try to have some real hooks in there to constantly ramp up the pressure around fugitive emissions, getting more serious about integrity in some of the offset systems. So we had the legislating 43% as a floor for 2030. Then the government had the safeguard mechanism, which is facilities over 100,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent a year, 215 biggest emitters currently, as a way to try and ratchet down their emissions. But again, I think some serious integrity issues there. It's essentially a carbon market of sorts. The government caved to fossil fuel companies and set a ceiling on the price of carbon credit units. The major parties then, a year or so later, did a deal to essentially change the safeguard mechanism for Santos and their project up off Darwin to be able to essentially export carbon to Timor-Leste, and that would sort of count or reduce their emissions. So, I think they've done a bit. I would have loved to have seen them do more, both on mitigation, adaptation. I think is something that we need to be talking more about as a country. Just we're woefully prepared, and we're not investing enough. A lot of experts in this field are saying we need to start investing in order of billions of dollars, $3 to $5 billion a year. The government has a fund that pushes out $200 million a year to invest in adaptation. So they're doing things, but I don't think at the scale or at the speed that is required. So I guess that's what they've done on climate, on environmental law reform. We were promised a lot, and really we've gone backwards. We saw the sea dumping was an amendment to the EPBC Act, and then on the very last day of Parliament, the major parties rammed through a bill that essentially exempts the salmon industry in Macquarie Harbour from any sort of oversight, and sort of kills the current review that's been sitting on Minister Plibersek's desk. It was narrowly targeted, but we think could and potentially will capture other projects. So, I think my hope is that the next Parliament will get far more serious about nature and climate, and a little bit biased, but as an independent, I really think a growing crossbench and a minority government is going to be the only way to essentially force the major parties to act in Australians' interests and not in the interests of vested interests on this issue. It's been pretty sobering seeing the level of lobbying and just power that the fossil fuel industry has in Parliament House. We've got an incredibly lax set of lobbying laws, and I don't know, time and time again, it seemed like they were basically getting what they wanted. And I think a great example is around the government's EPA, Environment Protection Australia, where myself and other crossbenchers and the Greens had essentially a written deal with Minister Plibersek to get it legislated. And the WA Premier flew into town, a couple of the big gas company execs flew into town, and the PM basically just killed the deal. So it is a problem. You all know that. But basically the whole crossbench is really trying to push reform that's actually going to introduce more transparency. My focus on climate and nature really has been around, one, how do we think longer term? I've got a bill that would legislate a duty of care to young people and future generations. It seems nuts to me that that's controversial. It went through the full Senate committee process. I think we had 403 submissions. 402 are supportive. The Institute of Public Affairs doesn't like it, and neither does the Labor Party or the Liberal Party. And for me, like that whole process really just highlighted how captured the major parties are when it comes to the fossil fuel industry. Another big push has been around electrification. I really think, one, it's just a huge opportunity for Australians to save money, but clearly there's some pretty significant emissions reductions, and I think it's really important in terms of social license at a time where we're seeing like a really well orchestrated campaign and astroturfing around certain issues, along with, I think, some very genuine concerns held by Australians in regional areas about what the transition means for them in terms of hosting big infrastructure and generation. electrification provides Australians with a really tangible way to see what the transition looks like. So I think, for people in cities, regional towns, we have to crack on with it. And then on the social license side of thing, I've worked with Helen Haynes quite a bit on really trying to push the government to ensure that regional communities are actually benefiting in a very meaningful way from hosting wind farms, solar farms, transmission lines, and not just that landholder, but actually the whole community. Like I think we have to rethink the way that we view energy, and renewable energy provides this opportunity to actually democratize energy in a way that hasn't been possible in the past. Zali Steggall and myself and most of the crossbench now have been pushing for a 2035 target. We've seen Labor punt that down the road. I think they feel very wedged by the coalition. Clearly, 2035 needs to be really ambitious and science aligned. We've been pushing for 75% as a minimum, as a floor, and we'll continue to do that. A couple of the other things that have been pushing is around adaptation. Had a briefing from the ONI, the Office of National Intelligence, on the risk of climate change to national security, and it's terrifying. The government, Australian governments have been getting these briefings from the early 80s, and we're not telling the truth to start with, and we're not prepared for what is coming. So I think adaptation needs to be increasingly a much bigger focus in Australia, and I think we're already starting to see towns and regions put under a huge amount of pressure with flood after flood after flood, and what that actually means in terms of recovery. Another one has been around the petroleum resource rent tax. How do you pay for all these things? My view is that the industries that have caused this should be paying. So I think actually getting some revenue from our gas exports is a total no-brainer. We've seen the coalition move with some plans. I haven't seen a lot of detail, but broadly plans for an East Coast reservation policy. I think that's a good idea. Australian gas should be offered to manufacturers, businesses, households first before it's exported. But I think on top of that, we need to see the political courage to actually get a fair share. Most of you would know that over 50% of our offshore LNG has no royalty attached to it. If you look at a company like Impex off Darwin, partly owned by Japan, they pay no petroleum resource rent tax, they pay no tax. And when I was up there for a Senate committee hearing, the NT government had taken us out on this boat to kind of see all the facilities. And the captain of the boat was a local fisherman, and he started sort of chiming in saying, oh, there's 50% less dolphins since this export hub's here. We're finding heavy metals in, crabs and all the rest that we're catching. And I said to the NT government reps, I said, well, what are you guys getting out of this? Clearly there's some serious trade-offs. And they kind of shrugged and said, well, we get payroll tax, which I think kind of shows what we're doing as a country. We're allowing big multinationals to make a lot of money off us, and we're not actually taking that to be able to invest in the future. And you contrast it with Norway's $2.8 trillion sovereign wealth fund. Qatar's got an $800 billion sovereign wealth fund, where we've been seriously missing out. So I mean, this election from the major parties, I haven't seen a lot that's going to change things a lot. I think there's been some really welcome announcements from Labor on electrification. I'd really love to see that pushed hard. I think we've got to make sure that low income households, people in social housing, people in apartments aren't left behind with that. The coalition clearly at war internally over net zero and the pathway on climate. I think initially they thought nuclear would solve that, where they had this sort of thing dangling out in the future. clearly hasn't gone down that well with Australians. And we saw in the budget reply speech from Peter Dutton 19 mentions of gas and one mention of nuclear, which I think kind of sums up what their climate plans are actually looking like.
Mm.
David,
Um,
there's a couple of questions, and it actually is a little bit aligned with what I was going to ask you as well. And I just wanted to also note that we know you've got young kids and that you don't want to be on the call for too long. So
no, good. I was
won't
gonna.
So Matt's asked, why do the mining and fossil fuel businesses have so much influence over Labor, and what will change take? Manu's asked, why is Tanya Plibersek getting the cold shoulder from, or why is she being sort of locked out? I
Yeah.
think I wanted to ask you, aligned with that, like how do we break these? It's really skewing our democracy,
Yeah.
vested interests. Many of us are, backing the crossbench and future crossbench in the hope that can really make a difference. And, obviously been so pleased with all the work that you've done, but what is it going to take to change?
Into Matt's question, I think one of the things the fossil fuel industry does really well is that they work the inside track. They've got relationships with government. There's also this revolving door of ministerial staff and ministers going and working for various industries. Martin Ferguson, after he allowed the export of gas from Queensland without a reservation policy, then went to work for the gas industry. So I think there's a lot of work to do there in tightening lobbying and the kind of jobs after you retire thing. How we change it, I really just think is, politics in the parliament, it really is a numbers game, and it's getting more communities to actually say, okay, well, if you guys aren't going to solve it, the major parties, then I'll send an independent to Canberra. And my hope is that a minority government sort of shifts that. It won't solve all the problems, but I think it'll be a big step towards trying to break that sort of nexus. But yeah, there's a lot of work to do there. On Plibersek, I don't know. I think it's comes down to party politics. I'm so grateful to be an independent and not have to. It's astonishing how much time they spend on internal politics. Yeah, I think I was pretty naive coming from sport. I figured, everyone on the team kind of is pulling in the same direction. They seem to fight each other a lot of the time. I think we're kind of just seeing that politics play out probably a little bit more publicly than many of them would like.
Mm. And David, just I mean, touching on the next parliament, and if there is a minority government, and you've got the independents have got the balance of power. I know there was a really good article in the Saturday paper that you were quoted about your views. But do you want to just share a bit of those in terms of how you would look at that, and how you would support whichever party?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the thing I'm hearing from people in the ACT is that people are sick of band-aid solutions. People know that these, you know, politicians are throwing out the word crisis a lot, but I think there's a lot of crises happening at the moment, and that is decades of short-term decision making, and a lack of sort of political leadership and courage to actually take these issues on. And so the thing I was talking about in that Saturday paper article is really how do we start to tackle the root causes of the challenges we're facing, from housing to climate to environment. There's solutions out there, but we've actually got to have politicians who are going to put Australians and our future ahead of self-interest, and also vested interests. So my hope is that that's what a minority and a growing crossbench can deliver. We saw, I'm just looking at Jen's question in there. Off the back of a growing crossbench, we've seen the major parties really stitch up electoral reform. Not this one, but the next election. It's going to be much, much harder for non-incumbent independents to actually win a seat. And I think that's a real problem for our democracy. So yeah, we all know, we're in the critical decade. These elections really matter, but I think they matter a lot more now that we have that electoral reform in place.
Thank you so much, David. We know how busy you are. It's
No,
actually
all good. This is
from the
fun.
sort of from I suppose where we sit, it's astonishing how much you get across. And you're, for better or worse, you've been in a hot seat. But I think so many of us really admire how you've stepped up and worked together with the other independents and really tried to put Australia first. And we really thank you, and we wish you good luck from all the various parts of Australia. Some of us are in ACT, but others aren't. If there's anything anyone on the call can do to help your campaign, please let us know.
Okay.
And otherwise, yeah, wishing you the very best for the coming weeks, and we very much hope to see you back in the next Parliament, doing just as much or more.
Really
Yeah,
appreciate
thank you. There's lots to do in there. I'd love to get back in and have another crack for a few more years, but we'll see what Canberrans think.
Good luck.
Okay, thanks very much, David.
Yes, thanks a lot.
Okay.
And now it's my pleasure to introduce Mark Mills. Mark is a partner at Generation Investment Management in the UK, who are a pure play sustainable investment management organisation established in 2004. To introduce Mark, he joined the founding team of Generation Investment Management in 2005 and is a member of the client team. Prior to that, Mark established a sustainable investment business in partnership with Zurich-based Sustainable Asset Management and led the operations in Australia. Mark has a BSc in Computer Science from Melbourne Uni and was the recipient of a postgraduate research scholarship from the Japanese government at Yokohama National University and speaks both Japanese and Mandarin. He's the chair of the Australian Wildlife Conservancy UK Trust, and he's also a founder and director of the Asia Investor Group on climate change. We're lucky that he's in Australia at the moment and has agreed to talk to our group, and he will be speaking about the investor road to net zero, and we'll have some questions after that. So Mark, over to you. Welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Carolyn and Stephen, and thank you both for the great work you've done in creating this platform, which is really so important for us to learn together and to discuss such important topics. So my aspect, I think, of the climate crisis is quite complementary to what we just heard from David, as we'll hear as I go forward. But the investment aspect is critical. David mentioned the sort of investment amounts we need in Australia. Well, on a global level, according to the International Energy Agency, we're going to need $4 trillion per year from 2030 to 2050 invested into climate solutions in order for us to achieve net zero. And I call this presentation an investor road to net zero or journey because I realized that I've been on this journey for 40 years, although in the first few years I didn't realize was net zero. We didn't talk about it then, but when I look at the things we've been trying to do, it's very similar. We have to do the same things today. So I wanted to share with you some of the learnings I've had on this journey. Hopefully that'll be helpful to the group. But I should say, in the interest of full transparency and disclosure, I guess you've raised this, Carolyn. I mean, I have no serious qualification in economics or finance at all. I am a software engineer gone wrong in life, crossed into the dark side after 10 years in the software industry. But in some ways, I think my lack of training in economics was helpful for me because I'm quite disappointed when I hear a lot of traditional economics talk about or not talk about things like the negative impacts of the things that economies and GDP growth provide. So anyway, if I go back to that time when I crossed over from software engineering to the investment bank, I was working in fixed income research for a few years, and then my boss and I were given the opportunity to set up a fund management business. So around that time, as I thought about investments, I really didn't know what I shouldn't be asking. So I was asking all these questions about environmental issues to my colleagues who I think found me quite annoying. And certainly I got the reputation as being a pink greenie because I was a tree hugger, but clearly I was a communist as well. So this was back in the 80s, the sort of view people had about me. Actually, interestingly, a couple of weeks ago, I heard there's another term for this, a watermelon. So I was actually a watermelon. So when I started looking at this from an investment perspective, back in those days, we started to see the rise of ethical investing, socially responsible investing. And I looked very closely at those for our own investment business. But I came to the conclusion that really, because these are all about what we don't do, it's about cutting things out, whether it's alcohol, tobacco, armaments, or whatever it is. The fact is, when we cut things out purely for ethical considerations, that is a perfectly fine thing for us to do as an individual investor, but it's not fine from a fiduciary viewpoint. And when we think about mobilizing the huge amounts of capital that we need to mobilize, we're going to have to tackle this fiduciary duty question. And the people who are making decisions on behalf of others have a legal obligation to act in their best interests and therefore get the best returns they can. And so it turned out to be very easy for the investment advisors in our industry to say, well, if you're taking out things for ethical reasons, you're actually not doing that. You're denying yourself good investment opportunities, and therefore this is not consistent with fiduciary duty. So I turned my attention to that problem and thought, well, what if we were to measure something called, I made this up, environmental performance of companies? And what if we were to do that along sector lines and to say, well, we're going to measure the environmental performance of all of the banks or the mining companies? And then what if we could rank them from the highest to the lowest and then invest in the best environmental performers across the industry? How would that look like from a fiduciary perspective and an investment perspective? And this later became called a best of sector approach, but the thinking I had was that perhaps we'd find a linkage in the longer term between these companies with solid environmental performance and financial outcomes over the longer term. So that was my big idea. I didn't really know how to implement it, but a short while later, I met a wonderful environmental economist who became my partner. And he said, yes, that's a good idea. So that was great. He thought it was a good idea, but also he could, more importantly, develop a survey and analysis to measure environmental performance. So we went out in 1999 to set up our own business and naively called our business Earth Index, kind of a motherly sort of name, we liked it, but it's probably not that best for a hardcore investment people. But in setting up businesses, I've come to the conclusion that no matter who you are setting up a business, I think you need to have some good luck. And I actually had two pieces of really good luck. And the first one occurred just a few months after we set up this business, when we read about the launch of the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. So this was combining a couple of very important innovations in investment. I eventually discovered, and you mentioned this, Carolyn, a group called Sustainable Asset Management. We're doing the research for this new index. They were based in Zurich, and it became clear that they were not only measuring environmental performance of companies, they were measuring social performance and governance. That was the first time I'd heard about this thing called ESG, but I thought, wow, that's fantastic. You guys are really doing something special here. And they put it all together to call this sustainability. And then the second most important thing here was that the Dow Jones name was there as a very hardcore financial name. It was a name that financial people would respect. But more importantly, they were creating an index based on these better companies going into the index. So a sense of competition emerged from the companies who wanted to be in the index, because that meant if they were in the index, they would have people investing in them. So it's capital into their company. But also there were brand and reputation issues about proudly displaying the logo as a member of this index. So 2 weeks after we learned about this, my partner and I turned up in Zurich. We met with the team and said, look, we'd love to bring your brand and methodology to Australia. They allowed us to do that. We didn't ask for any money. We just said, if we create something, we'll have this sharing arrangement. So we brought that back and we started to then build funds, but also to use that same methodology to create Australia's first sustainability index, and then started to proceed to build funds around this concept. And in the course of the next 3 or 4 years, we got the support of about 7 Australian super funds. So that's good because they're fiduciary investors. They're saying, well, look, there's potential here for these things to outperform an index or a benchmark. And by 2003, we had about 500 million Australian dollars in these funds, which sounds like a lot of money, not in the context of all the trillions we're going to need, but and sounds like a lot of money, but of course that's not our money, that's the client's money. And what we're doing is charging some small percentage amounts of the basis to enable ourselves to live. So that was good. I discovered covering family costs is a good thing in life. And so we seem to be off to a good start. And then I had my second piece of incredible luck. So in March 2003, there was a big sustainability conference in Sydney, and I knew the organizers and they thought it would be cool if I came along to talk about sustainable investing because no one had any idea what that was. And I thought it was cool because I could go to the conference without paying, because that was pretty good. But really the most significant thing was that the keynote speaker was a guy called Al Gore. And he did his fantastic speech on the climate crisis. He had probably an audience of 500 and standing ovation. I think I had about 30 in my audience, probably about the same number I've got today. And no need to stand. I didn't get a standing ovation last time, so no need to stand today. But the more important thing was there was a speakers get-together. And Al Gore asked me what I did. And I said, sustainable investing. And he said, what's that? And he literally started to grill me for an hour and a half on all of this sustainable investing concept. And Al, like many ex-politicians, was advising an investment firm, which he told me had no soul. There was nothing, there that he could really feel good about. And he was then on a mission then to explore sustainable investing. Now, to cut a long story short, he met this guy called David Blood in London, who was running Goldman Sachs Asset Management. They got on very well, and they decided to set up their own firm dedicated to sustainable investing. And my piece of good luck was then to be invited to go along and join this team as one of the members of the founding team. So we moved our family there 20 years ago. So we're now into the next phase of sustainable investing for me, which is really to create more active investment strategies. So what I talked to you before was what we could call more of a passive type of approach. It was simply looking at sustainability aspects. But as we want to get more active, that means we want to add more return for our investors. And it means we're going to be paid more for our services. But there's a very important need to demonstrate financial return when we're getting into this space. We were in creating a global equity portfolio. So we're going to choose 40 to 50 companies. And because we now had strong capital backing, we could recruit really high-class investment professionals who were also, of course, passionate about sustainability. That was the concept here. And we are using a lot of traditional investment techniques. So we're all admirers of Warren Buffett. We'd like to do a lot of the things he would talk about because whatever he says makes a lot of sense, but we're doing something that Warren tends not to do. That is to bring in the sustainability thinking in the way we assess the quality of businesses. So we started that 20 years ago. And to give you some idea of, and I talked about the importance of financial return, I think many of us here who are investing at all will probably be familiar with index funds. We may have that in our own portfolio. We'll know they used to be low cost. And if you want to use active management, you'll pay more, but your expectation is to get more than the index. That was fair enough. So we set a target of 3 to 4% above the global index. In here, we're talking about something like MSCI World is a recognized index. And 2 months ago, we had our 20th year of track record in this strategy. And I'm just very pleased to say that actually, when I look at our returns, we actually ended up 3.5% per annum above that benchmark. It may not sound like a lot, but the power of compounding is a really important thing in investment. So to give you an idea, if you'd put your $10,000 into an index, global index, compounding, that's sort of an 8% return over 20 years, 8% per year. That would have given you about $46,000. But if you'd put it in a fund like ours, where you get 3.5% per annum more over that time, then that would be almost twice your money. So for people in pension funds who are saving for retirement, this compounding effect is really important. But from the purpose of developing sustainable investments, which people can really feel will be important to their wealth creation, and we had a mission to build the business case for sustainable investing. That's really why I'm telling you this, because on the one hand, it's great to have someone like Al Gore who talks very well about sustainable investing. Everybody knows that unless we're delivering on the returns, there's no credibility. So it's important that we demonstrate performance, but we also took another step back in 2005, where we worked with some other people who were starting to get interested in this subject to create what is known as the Principles of Responsible Investment. I don't know, Carolyn and Steve, if you've heard about that or not. I think it's quite well known. But it's a charter group, was set up under the auspices of the United Nations. And what it essentially is, as a member, if you decide to join the PRI, you're agreeing to start to incorporate sustainable investing in the way you operate. So that has grown enormously well over the years. As of the last count, there are something like 5,000 investors, investment managers, pension funds, insurance companies, all around the world who have signed up to demonstrate that they want to do sustainable investing. And collectively, they represent about 122 trillion US dollars. So at this point, you could probably look at me and say, well, Mark, you said we needed 4 trillion a year. You just said there's 122 trillion sitting in sustainable investing. What's the problem? Well, so the problem is the problem of impact. And that's now the next sort of thing I'd like to talk about is impact. What are our investments actually contributing in terms of impact into a sustainable world? And it's something we've been very keen to explore ourselves for many, many years. We started measuring the impact of our private equity investments in 2008. We didn't start measuring the impact of our public equity funds because it's actually really challenging to do that. And I don't know anyone who does it well. So if we're thinking about a big publicly listed company like Microsoft or Amazon, to be able to measure the impact of those companies in a detailed way is very, very challenging. I say I don't know anyone who does it. But when we look at the private equity work that we're doing, and we're investing in companies that we are wanting to create goods and services to help us move towards a more sustainable economy, these are of a size where we can measure impacts, and we've been doing that for a long time. But about 5 years ago, as we got more and more concerned about the world not meeting its climate targets, about the increasing extinction rates and the decreasing pressures on nature, we asked ourselves, what more can we do? And we necessarily looked then at the impact of our investments. And we came to a rather sad conclusion, which was that sustainable investing, as we'd been practicing it, although it was absolutely necessary, was no longer sufficient in the context of us reaching our targets of net zero. Our own company has a target of 2040, by the way, but more generally accepted is the 2050 target. So in asking ourselves what more we can do, we said, well, how about we build in very ambitious impact into the way we invest money at the very beginning. So we came up with a figure of 240 megatons of net carbon reduction, CO2 net reduction, for $1 billion of capital. And as an ambition and a goal, that was multiples of what we were doing already in the normal way we're doing things. And we set up a new entity, which we call Just Climate, which we like the name of because it emphasizes the focus on climate, but also it also emphasizes as a double entendre, or just transition as well. So this entity then was aiming to achieve this impact with all of its investments that it's making. And we started in the industrials area, and something interesting happens when you build in that kind of impact. It means you have to go to where the emissions are coming from. So we know where the emissions are coming from. We know that 7% is coming from steel, 7 to 8% from cement, concrete. We know that 25% is coming from agriculture. We know that the grid is still producing huge amounts of it. So we have to find solutions in all of those areas. And the interesting thing is that by and large, solutions exist. It's just really difficult to make them work and to scale them up, and you need to have a whole different kind of investment team. But we decided to take on that challenge, and with our very first fund, we said we need to raise $1 billion because it needs to be something the big players around the world can think of as something serious. It can't be a $50 million impact fund. And we were delighted when we raised $1.5 billion, so 50% above our target. And I think it's an important question to say, well, why? I asked myself, why could we actually do that? Like, the word new is a good word in many industries, but it's a really bad word in investments. People hate new things in investments. They want to see 5-year track records, proven teams. But the reason we could do it, I think, is that we could demonstrate that there was potential again for return. So with this first fund, with that $1.5 billion, we've started investing that now. And I might just give you an example of one of our investments and also look at it from my financial perspective as to why we think this can be profitable, but also what more we need to do to make it even more profitable. So the example I will give you is in the area of green steel. So we've invested in a green steel plant. It's in the north of Sweden, where there is hydroelectricity, which can be used to turn water into green hydrogen. And we're using the green hydrogen instead of coal to make our steel. And we've had the pilots have proven to us that the technologies can do that. And by the end of next year, we should be making steel in commercial quantities. Now, it turns out that for us to make steel this way will cost 20% more than people can make it using the traditional way. That's what Bill Gates calls the green premium. What people need to pay more to do something to be green like this. Now, in a normal world, you would say, well, why on earth are you going to make exactly the same product that's cost 20% more? But the thing is, we really are not in a normal world. We're in this transition period. And so the exciting thing when we look at this project is that we can sell all of the steel today in an offtake arrangement that covers that 20% premium. And why can we do that? Well, one of our biggest customers who have agreed to buy this steel are electric vehicle manufacturers, promising their customers you can have, emission-free driving if you source your fuel from sunshine electricity. But what about the embodied carbon in the steel that we're providing you? Many of the better car makers, in terms of, I say better from an ethical viewpoint, really, are buying carbon credits to offset these at the moment. And we heard from Freddie about carbon credits recently. I think this is a really good use of carbon credits because they're being used as an interim measure. And now these car companies are saying, well, actually, if we buy this green steel, we don't need to pay for these carbon credits when we'll pay a bit more for our steel. So all of that fits together really well. And we feel that this is going to be a profitable business based on things today. But the real thing is to say, if we think about attracting capital and we want to get to this 4 trillion per year, what more should we be doing to make it attractive? And using the steel as an example, it's clear that if governments just had sensible policies, these would be really attractive. And I'm not talking about subsidies. All I'm talking about is something sensible like, A, don't subsidize fossil fuels. I mean, that should be a no-brainer, but don't do that. And B, David said it again, make the polluters pay for what they're doing. If you do those two things, then this green steel plant is going to be a hugely profitable enterprise, because the steel makers they're competing with would actually have to pay for the way they're producing their steel, which is not the case at the moment. So when I look back on this period of the journey that I've outlined, I mentioned that I didn't realize I was on this journey, but the thing that is similar is that this need to be able to demonstrate financial return is critical for us to solving the climate crisis and getting that capital in. So politics really and political outcomes really do matter. Because what I have learned in this period is that even if our planet was on fire, people with fiduciary duty would not invest in the fire hoses unless I could show them how they're going to make good returns. So that's the world we live in. I hope from this discussion that you will appreciate that not only is the way you invest your money important, but also who you vote for.
Thank you, Mark. You've been on an incredible road, haven't you, really? And you've been there, really, you're one of the leaders right from the very beginning. So thanks for sharing that. What I might do is just, we got some questions coming in, and Carol and I've got some, but just that road and looking forward, it would be great to get you just to think about where is that road heading, I suppose, and particularly in light of what's happened in, with the Trump election in the US and everything. So, and just with ESG generally, and where does Australia sit within that? How do you see?
Yeah, no, that's it is distressing really to see what's happening, and this ESG backlash is real. There's really stupid things happening, but because we've been involved in this for a long time, we can see that it's actually probably the third major setback. It's probably increased in severity, but when I look back on this other setbacks, we had the global financial crisis was a setback. We saw a big change in commitments from governments around that time. But actually, we bounced back much more strongly. And when I look at some of the investment returns that we had, actually these periods of dislocation and the setback are also some very interesting times to be investing. So we came back strongly from that pullback in the global financial crisis. The second setback was Trump won. And what happened after that was we saw the IRA brought. That was a hugely, very important piece of legislation coming back. Now, I won't deny that this is probably the most serious setback we've had, and also the timing couldn't be worse because we just don't have that much time. So it is very serious setback. But the reason we have these comebacks is because the science doesn't change. Nothing. No, this is just unfortunate politics, and we will come back. The only question is how much damage gets done before we come back, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And what about within Australia? When you look at, how's Australia been on that journey, and where's it heading, do you think?
So I have seen politics does influence us in Australia as well. The party which set us back so much on climate change for such a long time took really very ugly ways of trying to prevent progress from the investment viewpoint. They started putting benchmarks on pension funds, which pretty well stopped them from being able to do some of these things I'm talking about, because they would mark them up against benchmarks which were full of fossil fuels. Now, if you take a long-term view like we do, we've not invested in fossil fuels since 2009, so that's now 16 years. Even then, it was a couple of companies like British Gas, where we at that time thought the gas transition was important. We've obviously changed our view since then. But these kind of political games that the previous government played had an impact on our own investors here and what they felt they could do. We've obviously been blessed to see that change to a certain extent, but we're a little bit slow here, I would say. If I take that fund I mentioned, the Just Climate First Fund, with a $1.5 billion, there was not a single dollar from Australia in there, I'm afraid to say. That's just, to me, sad, because they it's going to be, I think it's going to be a good fund, and we should be supporting these things. We actually have so much opportunity here in this world. I mean, if I think about green steel, it's great to have one in Sweden, but why aren't we having one here? You know, we're going to have got the iron ore, we got the sunshine, we got the wind, we got everything pretty well we need to do the same. So we've got a very good opportunity here. And something I didn't mention, but is really very exciting for me, is the other part of Just Climate, which is natural climate solutions. So part one is let's invest to stop putting up those emissions. Part two is how can we invest to be drawing them down? And when we think about transforming the agricultural system, building carbon back into soils is going to be good for our agriculture, good for the atmosphere as well. We've raised $200 million so far, and we're targeting 750. So we're on a journey there as well. But I think the reason I'm raising this is that actually my colleagues are really excited about the potential for investing in Australia as well. You know, there's very, very good things we can be doing here, both in industrials and natural climate solutions.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. And what about greenwashing? You know, how do you tell if something's, you know, authentic or it's greenwashing?
That is such a good question, Stephen. And I actually was thinking about raising this, and now I will raise it because I'm pretty proud of it. So I told you that we are putting impact at the forefront of these Just Climate strategies, and we have this target of 240 million tons of net reduction. Now, greenwash is a real problem. And so what we decided to do is very common in these private equity funds to have a performance fee attached. If you're in the industry, you would call it carry. If you're not, we'll just call it a performance fee. And so the way it works is the manager who's offering these funds will get 20% of that performance above a hurdle. So if the fund gets 20% per year, that's 12%, 20% of that 12% becomes a good amount of money to go back to the manager. That's very well accepted across the private equity industry. What we did is to say, but we want to get the impact as well. So we're sure we'll start with a financial performance that the team can have, but hey, let's have a look at your target for impact. Did we get that 240 megatons? If we didn't, well, suppose we got 120. So suppose we got half of what we said we want to achieve. That team will get half of the performance fee that they would otherwise have been due. Now, I can't think of any better way to stamp out greenwash and make people put their money where their mouth is, and our team are up for this. But I would encourage other investment managers to be doing this around the world. And I'd love it if more people put pressure on them when they're looking at what they're offering to stamp out greenwash. This is a really great way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
We've got some really interesting questions in the chat. So I'm going to start at the top and we'll just work our way down and hopefully get through them all. Lisa's written, recently major banks have walked away from their commitments to the environment as a result of Trump's election. How does this impact the investment landscape?
None of this is helpful. We're really quite cross at these organizations that are pulling out. We feel that the people will know who is serious and who is not, and those people will not do well as a result of their cowardliness. But I have to say we are seeing the effects of this kind of action on our ability to raise funds. In fact, I was in Japan a couple of weeks ago where we have a client very interested in investing in natural climate solutions. And he just said, look, because of these banks pulling out, he's with a big Japanese conglomerate, we're just having to pause and think about. So it's creating a level of uncertainty, which is definitely affecting our ability to be pushing forward on these things. So sadly, it does have an effect.
Matt's asked, are there still large capital inflows coming to environmentally focused funds?
I suppose on a broader level, I would say there's been pause here as well. People are uncertain. And as I said, I suppose even I'm seeing that firsthand with people just being more cautious right now. It's certainly having an effect on the fundraising side of things for sure. So
Ask, is that to do with the topic being environmental, or is that to do with everybody feeling like they're on less solid ground and they just don't have the confidence that they had about tomorrow, what will the tariffs be or what will the market be?
I think it's in the context of really this broader, people talk a lot about the ESG backlash, and it's having very strange effect. I think it's the bigger effect it's having is what I would call green hush, rather than there are a lot of people who are still maintaining their commitments. Yes, we're seeing, as your participant said, that some people are pulling out. Others are just going into a green hush mode. There's some ridiculous things happening in the world. So one of my people I met with recently who has a big operation in the States, he's definitely suffering from it. And he explained to me that because you've got algorithms searching the web for everything that's been written and looking for things to attack, anyone who's talked about biodiversity now is being hauled up by the algorithms. And it seems the Trump administration doesn't really know the difference between diversity and biodiversity. But the way that these companies are thinking about tackling this is just to cross out that word diversity and replace it with nature. So, people are just finding ways to just keep their head below the parapet, keep doing what they're doing where they can, and just wait for this change to come, which will come. The question is how soon, and I think there may even be a Trump backlash, which is bigger than the ESG backlash. We have seen that with a recent election in the States. We've got the midterms coming up next year, and we saw the same sort of backlash with Trump won. I don't know why people have such short memories, but I think this will happen again. Again, the question is how much damage gets done before we sort this out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Now we've got one here from Melody. So within our group, we've got a number of people that are based in the UK. And Melody said here, in the UK, we have something quite niche called packaging EPR. Yeah. Can you see that question? It's quite a long question here. Can you see that one? Extended producer responsibility, which follows the polluter pays principles that you referenced. The only issue is the impact assessment always permits 80% of the cost burden to be passed on to the consumer. Do you see this as a pattern in your industry visibility also? Your industry visibility also?
I have to confess I wasn't aware of this legislation, but it does sound encouraging to me. But you're saying that yeah.
So I suppose that's asking, about this responsibility for polluters pay.
Right. Yeah. Look, maybe if I now try to interpret this from the investment perspective, and I've talked about the need for what I call sensible government policy. I think the corresponding issue here is who actually is going to be paying, and Macron, I think, learned a really big lesson about this, and this is why I say the just transition is really important. So we actually can't, when we talk about removing subsidies, we have to be careful about who is being affected by these subsidies and make sure that at the same time as we do that we're not going to be penalizing those who can't afford it. That's why the just transition aspect is so important. So this is certainly a potential issue for the investment industry where we want to see this kind of sensible legislation, but we do have to acknowledge it has to be done in a way which is not going to affect the less fortunate.
Ties back around to government policy.
Yep.
Yeah. And then Kate's asked here, can you maybe give us some examples of the sorts of natural capital solution investments that are generating strong returns?
All right. Well, we actually just made 2, so I'd be remiss to say we're making strong returns yet, but we're very excited about them. We've only been because I mentioned we raised $200 million. That meant once we raised that first portion, we'd been following a couple of companies for a while, and we're very excited about both of them. So I can talk about them, but not in the context yet of making these returns. But the first is in the area of crop protection. So we know that the use of pesticides and fungicides and all sorts of chemicals are not only using fossil fuels, they're incredibly damaging to the environment. So there's a company called Greenlight Bioscience, which has done a lot of work on RNA, which became very famous during COVID. And it turns out that RNAi, or RNAi, which I stands for interference, can be used in a very highly targeted way to attack the protein, the creation development of a particular gene, a particular species. So we can put this into a product which we spray onto land and crops, and it can end up in the waterways, it can end up anywhere without having any harmful effect. The only thing it's going to harm is the particular pest that we're trying to stop eating our crops. So that we're very excited about. We waited until it got its first regulatory approval before we invested, and then we now think we're ready to scale this one up. The other one is called Naturmetrics. Now, we do have many companies around the world making commitments to looking after nature, and they're going to need tools to help them do that. And if a company has a whole large land holding and doesn't really know what they've got, there is a company called Naturmetrics that can help them using something called environmental DNA. So instead of someone coming around with a clipboard to sort of count how many frogs you've got, we can take samples of soil, air, water, have them shipped back for the diagnostic lab, and we can have a very good understanding of the species that are around, and that can inform the clients as to what they've got, and they can make decisions on how to protect it. So those are our first two investments. There's a whole pipeline that we're looking at, and we look forward to making more. But I can't tell you yet that we've made these strong returns, I'm afraid.
I love the sound of that Naturmetrics one. I mean, they both sound fantastic, but measurement is just so key. So that's terrific.
Yeah, they sound great. Now, Peter's asked, you mentioned fiduciary duty. Does the way it applies to green investing vary significantly among different countries? For example, Australia versus the US?
I don't think that whether it's green or any kind of investing, I don't think that really changes. Concept of fiduciary duty is something we encounter around the world, and something we have to, and it's not a bad thing. I think there's a reason it exists. I think we just need to say, look, we've got to tackle it this way by demonstrating these are the returns. And we've been very consistently giving the same message around the world, whether it's the US or Australia or anywhere. And when we're giving examples of the sorts of returns we think we can get, we have to be very upfront and say, we're not going to build in any forecasts of carbon pricing or regulation. Because if we did that, that would affect the returns we would get in a good way. If there's more, just like the example I gave with green steel. So what we've said to clients is we're just going to make our analysis on the basis of what we have today, business as usual. But I think what's really interesting all around the world is that when we tell clients this, they say, well, we've got our own worldview. So if to be an investor, you have to have some kind of worldview. And the question is, over the next 10 years, what will the carbon regulation pricing look like? We're saying in our analysis, we're not going to make any assumptions. But the clients, then we get into a very interesting discussion with clients around the world who say, okay, well, we think there will be stronger climate regulation. So if you think you're going to get 20%, well, we think it could be 25. And this is a really important point, because the fiduciary duty people here are saying, okay, there's a really good reason for me to make this. Under this scenario, these investments will do really well. And then something else happens, which is equally interesting, is they say, okay, if there's tighter carbon regulation and pricing, these climate-led assets, we call them climate-led assets that I've just talked to you about, they're going to do well. But what about my other investments where I've got all these embedded carbon? They're probably not going to do so well, are they? So the conversation changes from one of purely risk return to that very important topic in investing, which is diversification. And that's a very well accepted aspect of fiduciary duty all around the world, is diversification. So if you can show that your particular investments are going to behave this way, and a lot of green investments that the question asked about will behave that way, then it's introducing diversification from the viewpoint of what investment people call factor risk. Under this scenario, this will do well. Under this scenario, this will do less well. But we need to be having a spread of investments to be fulfilling our fiduciary duty. That's quite common around the world.
Great, thanks, Mark. Yeah, very, very interesting. Okay. I think we're we sort of skirted around this one, but it'd be good to get your thoughts just on carbon offsets and yeah, you've got any comments on that?
No, there's no doubt. I think there's an important role to play, and the example I gave with the electrical vehicle manufacturers is, I think, an example of how they should be used. But there's some other aspects here about carbon offsets, and that is we have seen some very bad behaviors in the market for sure, which is sad because there's an important role for them to play, but they have caused people to be disillusioned, quite rightly, when people do the things that we've seen happen. You know, claiming credits for things that they should never have done, or if they're saying they're going to use the money to support poor communities and then not actually do that, that really undermines the whole cause. So as we look at them, and it's important for our nature fund that we have a view on this. We were very clear when we developed our natural climate solutions that it wasn't going to be a carbon fund, but nevertheless, there would be opportunities for us to enhance returns by judicious use of carbon. But what we're looking at is what we call the high quality carbon. So in other words, you've got different actors in the markets, and you've got some people who are wanting to just greenwash. They're happy to pay the lowest price possible. I call them the low quality buyers. They just happen to be a lot of fossil fuel companies in that, but it's not, don't have to go there, but there's a low quality end of the market, just greenwashers. Then you have the very high quality buyers, and I would put Microsoft in that category. And they've invested with us, they've supported us, and they just grill us. When they look at anything, they are really serious because their own brand and reputation is at stake. If they're going to go out buying credits and it turns out they were diddled by people using poor quality credits. So there is what we call a high-end market of high-quality producers and high-quality buyers. And that's the market we want to be participating in. And we think there will be opportunities for our natural climate solutions to enhance returns. So maybe as a quick example, we think the whole area of agroforestry is a very interesting one, where we're putting in cover trees and crops to protect crops. We're improving soils. And those trees that we might be growing within the crops will be trees that we're not going to cut down. So they're kind of high quality credits that we could be getting from that. Underlying that, we see the crops themselves as providing the bulk of return, but it's a bit like having some icing on our cake. So those would be some of the things we'd be looking to do in our Natural Climate Solutions Fund. And we see this whole market as having a very important role to play, and we just have to do it better.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, thanks, Mark.
So interesting. Thank you. I think we've got to the end of the questions in the chat, and it's also 9:10. So, Mark, thank you so much. I've again learned so much tonight. It's been really fantastic to hear all you've had to say. So thank you for being so generous with your experience and all that you've learned, and I suppose all the amazing work that you're doing. Thank you and congratulations, and yeah, please keep at it, and maybe we'll hear an update in years to come, because
yeah, well, I think you're going to have to struggle to stop me, I'm afraid.
I've heard that, Mark. And
sorry about that.
No,
No,
great.
that's
Fantastic.
great. You're an
Yeah,
inspiration.
yeah.
And I just also want to say a thank you to Julia and Mark, because you're often suggesting fantastic speakers for our group. So thank you very
Yeah,
much.
yeah.
Most appreciated.
Okay, I I haven't put my wife to sleep, have I? I'm just
No, she's still awake, I think. She might
All
have
right.
left.
Well, thank you again, Carolyn and Stephen, and thank you everybody for your interest and participation.
Yeah, thanks a
Thank
lot, Mark.
you.
Really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
We hope everyone's enjoyed tonight. With the election just around the corner, we know that lots of people are keen to be involved. If you'd like to get involved with any of the independents that are standing around the country, or with any of the Greens that are standing, please let us know. We've got good connections to lots of different people. We know lots of you are already volunteering. But yeah, if anybody else wants to get involved, please do. We're going to be involved. Stephen's going to be working on Zali's running his booth captain on one of Zali's booths, and I'll be volunteering there as well. I know I can see Lisa, and I know she's working hard for Monique, and I know there's many others of you, and I know Jen's somewhere. She's a super hard worker for the Greens. And why these candidates? Because they have a positive view on and a proactive view on climate. And if anybody else, any other major parties want to do the same, then we'll be happy to support them too. If you'd like to donate financially to a candidate, we know that they'd be appreciated, and obviously including David, who kindly gave up his his time. I've stolen your thunder about volunteering doing Zali.
Yes, anybody wants to come and hand out some how to vote cards on the 3rd, let me know. Got some spots for my booth, so very keen to have any extra help. Thank you.
Next month we have Kirsten Junior, who's the CEO of Reverse Garbage, talking. It's on Monday the 12th of May. Reverse Garbage is Australia's largest creative reuse centre. Every year they save over 260 tonnes of valuable resources from languishing in landfill, and educate over 16,000 people on the importance of reuse. And that's their 50th birthday this year. So they're an amazing organisation. I'm really looking forward to hearing about probably the things that I might not know about them, and also what they've got their plan in terms of plans for the future. We'll know by then the result of the federal election, and then hopefully it's a result that enables the preservation of our climate, environment and biodiversity, and keeping us moving forward in a really positive way. So thanks everyone. Have a great night and week, and great to see, Matt, that you're working in Gilmore. Fantastic.
Excellent.
That is really great.
Yeah.
I hope that goes well. That's a very close seat, and yeah,
Good luck.
some people we don't want, so
No.
that's great.
There you go.
Thanks everyone, and have a great night.
Yeah, thanks.